Hey everybody, this is Rydo, and today we're looking at Dear Esther Landmark Edition. So this is a remake in Unity remaster of an independent game called Dear Esther, although this time it's the Chinese room that's really making the game, and it's not independent because it has a publisher and isn't just self-publishing it. The Chinese room isn't self-publishing it. Also, as a 2017 remaster, it claims that there's randomly generated visuals and audio and things like that. I question a lot of that, certainly. Even now in 2023, it would be weird to start to see games that could actually use like artificial intelligence to generate images or visuals or videos or audio. You could certainly randomly generate noises, sounds at certain frequencies, and you could probably have a much more dumbed down system to cut and paste random parts of other sounds, but that's about it. This was a fairly early walking simulator game, really establishing where I first heard the concept of walking simulators. At a certain level, you can't go much further than, say, 2005, 2000. You can't go any further back and expect any game to really be described as a walking simulator because the graphics just wouldn't be big enough and good enough to feel like a walking simulator, and the level design would just not be big enough. You wouldn't have the Unity asset store or the Unreal Engine asset store to lean on to make big open areas where you could walk around too, so it would have taken a lot more work. On a certain level, really old dungeon crawler games aren't too different from walking simulators, except for the fact that most dungeon crawlers have more than just walking going on. But yeah, this would have been one of the first games to use that phrase. This also would have been one of the earliest games to receive just a lot of hype. Particularly for me, that would have been me listening to the Giant Bombcast and hearing people talk about Dear Esther and games like Dear Esther way too much, promote it way too much, where it's very possible that this game is not relevant and really didn't have a high chance of ever being relevant. There's a heck of a lot of stuff going on as I'm recording, as far as Unity losing its fandom, and even before that, there's definitely a move to move walking simulators away from the Unity engine into the Unreal Engine, which would allow you to just make the graphics even better. The Vanishing of Ethan Carter is a game I covered, and that was a game that was made in the Unreal Engine and then remade or updated or patched to the next version of the Unreal Engine and ran even better and looked even better, although it really should have run perfectly fine either way. Vanishing of Ethan Carter also has some puzzles in it, where this may be a pure walking simulator. By default, this game did not have closed captions on. I'm going to turn them on. I might even decide to turn on large captions. I don't think, since I'm wearing headphones, it makes a lot of sense to change the audio settings there. And the audio music stopped there. It got the resolution correct by default, but I did come in here and turn up the anti-aliasing to 8x instead of full 4x, so maybe I'm pushing it for my graphics card, but I doubt it. And then I'm using an Xbox controller, and having control support certainly is appreciated when you're talking about a game where you're going to walk around quite a bit. Now, I have managed to know absolutely nothing about Dear Esther, but then when the game claims that it's going to be randomly generated, I question if maybe there isn't actually that much story here anyways. On a certain level, if you took a really old game like Myst and you took all the puzzles out of it, that game is also a walking simulator at that point. Of course, then Myst would also be very boring as a game and would not have maintained its niche fandom for as long as it has, even to today. So I've always kind of felt like the walking simulator genre was a intellectual dead end, because it's like making a video game with one hand tied behind your back, and there's just no reason to do that other than a lack of ability to program or a lack of creativity. So with the remastered graphics, you also get a director's commentary, and it looks like we've got 4 chapters here. So let's start at the lighthouse. Yeah, I'm surprised I haven't actually been somewhat spoiled on this.
Dear Esther, the gulls do not land here anymore. I've noticed that this year they seem to shun the place. Maybe it's the depletion of the fishing stock driving them away. Perhaps it's me. When he first landed here, Donnelly wrote that the herds were sickly and their shepherds the lowest of the miserable classes that populate these Hebridean islands. 300 years later, even they have departed.
So that's a lot of text, so having bigger subtitles there is probably not necessary or helpful. We're sitting here and we hear sound effects and music, kind of a wailing, singing song, and then we see a lighthouse. So I suspect even during the dialogue I could have moved the cursor. No prompt for sitting there for too long. And yeah, seems like we can just walk off. So there's something. Wow. You typically don't expect that.
Come back.
Yeah. Interesting. I just got an achievement for drowning once. You typically don't expect to be able to drown or die in any way in a walking simulator. Admittedly, the graphics look great. Yeah. And yeah, I'm actually a little shocked that the Unity engine can have this good of graphics. And I don't want to get into a long rant or conversation about Unity basically trying to change its pricing style very quickly and that irritating everybody, but I will mention that that is going on as I'm recording this. I've always felt like Unity as an engine was really more targeting cell phone games, and so this doesn't look bad enough to really be a cell phone game, although in all fairness modern cell phones could probably handle slightly better graphics than what we're seeing here. You have a slow kind of movement speed here. I could see make an argument to speeding this whole thing up. We've got what I assume are all just pre-made assets of a building, of a toilet. You have a flashlight item. I guess the question is, could we even speed up things? I mean, we could probably change the sensitivity and mess things up that way, but I think for the most part the game wants you to walk at a slow pace. So My default thought here is that, can we zoom in? Yes, we can with the left trigger. Or right trigger. Or left bump or right bump. Good. Good to know. So maybe we'll trigger things by zooming in and looking on things. Maybe we'll get achievements around that. Maybe we'll trigger things happening. So we start with a guy talking and saying, "Dear Esther." That feels like that means he's writing a letter. That feels like there's some level of displacement, and in stories usually it's most interesting to assume that it's the highest level of everything, that everything's taken to the extreme. So what's the most extreme way in which Esther could be displaced from this main character? It would be that she was dead. What is this? Bleach? 2 hydrogens, 3 hydrogens, and then a carbon, and then an oxygen in this. Yeah. Let's see, do we have any buttons? A zooms in, X zooms in, Y zooms in, B zooms in. Okay. D-pad controls analog stick. Back button doesn't do anything. Pause button pauses this. This is a game that is slightly old enough. So everything seems to zoom, which means there's probably not an interactive button until we walk up to something, if we're going to interact with things at all. This might be a case here where the game randomizes. I could see having several different textures of different chemicals. HL or HI here. But yeah, I would assume Esther is dead. So, as far as the most extreme version, we have a broken mirror, so they don't have to animate reflections. And so if I'm going to assume Esther is dead, then you take the next extreme question is, what is the most extreme way in which Esther could be dead, and that it would be most impactful to the character we're playing as, which leads me to assume he killed her one way or another. Maybe through negligence, maybe through a mistake or ignorance. So you make that you make that assumption to take it to the next step. Then, since the game seems like it is built around the idea of figuring out what the narrative is, then it would be my guess that the assumption is that we're supposed to come to terms with Esther being dead and us being involved, forgive ourselves. Coming to an area like this would really feel like a nostalgic potential direction and way to let go. I kind of feel like that paint there should have a few drops that are more obvious back to this way, so it would draw your eye in that direction. And so it seems to me like you've got a branching path where you either go up or you go down, and you really don't see games make it this obvious, but games probably do things like this fairly often, although only if you're really focused on branching path narratives would you have a narrative change whether you go up or down. In most cases, you would spend so much energy animating and creating each part of a game, you'd want the player to see every part of the game, or at least most parts of the game. And that's where you inherently have most branching paths in video games be incredibly superficial, a la 3 different color shaders, depending on your decision at the end of Mass Effect 3, or saying yes or no to a question in a conversation for the conversation to then simply loop back to a rigid narrowing point where the same dialogue would be said regardless of whether you said yes or no. Because you don't have a jump button, which is normally what you would expect, I don't feel particularly confident to just jump. So I guess I was just supposed to hug the wall there. You have a little bit of a beaten path that we can kind of follow, and then a lot of...
Donnelly reported the legend of the hermit, a holy man who sought solitude in its most pure
should
form.
walk while you talk.
Allegedly, he rode here from the mainland in a boat without a bottom, so all the creatures of the sea could rise at night to converse with him. How disappointed he must have been with their chatter. Perhaps now, when all that haunts the ocean is the rubbish dumped from the tankers, he'd find more peace. They say he threw his arms wide in a valley on the south side, and the cliff opened up to provide him shelter. They say he died of fever 116 years later. The shepherds left gifts for him at the mouth of the cave, but Donnelly records they never claimed to have seen him. I have visited the cave and I have left my gifts, but like them, I appear to be an unworthy subject of his solitude.
So wherever you go, triggers audio. From the looks of it. We have this Donnelly character. Arguably, maybe I should crank up the brightness a little bit. There's definitely some differences between the few walking simulators. It looks like I'm gonna fall here. We'll see what happens. Well, that looks like that was the end there. You have a game like Gone Home, which is effectively a walking simulator where you can scare yourself to death if you let your imagination go wild, but nothing actually happens in Gone Home. And it tells a very interesting story that will probably sneak up on you a little bit as far as the meaning. And it kind of has this mystery to it as far as what you're trying to find out. Then there's another one where I can't even remember the name of it, but it was not particularly that interesting. Let's just go back to all the way to where the path would have started here and just walk both paths, at least as far as we can. There was another one I recently played where you were in a spaceship and you were looking at like 3D recordings of conversations that happened in the spaceship and trying to figure out what happened. Although in that case, you find out what's happening, and then the ending is pretty much just a twist with surprise endings. And there's just no way that the one thing that would make you feel like you were doing better or worse at the game, a walking simulator, could have happened in that game. Like, and I guess that's kind of the problem with a lot of walking simulators, is that if you're going to treat them like mysteries, most of them are going to have a surprise reveal at the end that you couldn't possibly have guessed, or you just wouldn't have been given any clues to actually guess it. You could, I guess, baselessly speculate, and that's not particularly fun. So maybe that's not what you're supposed to do with walking simulators. Maybe you are just supposed to sit back and relax and enjoy the story. I imagine that's what most people would describe them as. There is another one that called Firewatch, which Firewatch 2 has, from what I've seen of it, has that real problem of there being not enough of a story, not good enough of a story to justify going through the entire experience. Inherently, and again, this is an example, I think, of why walking simulators.
At night, you can see the lights sometimes from a passing tanker or trawler.
This is where
From up on the cliffs, they
the
are
stories
mundane.
get merged again.
But down here, they fugue into ambiguity. For instance, I cannot readily tell if they belong above or below the waves. The distinction now seems banal. Why not everything and all at once? There's nothing better to do here than indulge in contradictions whilst waiting for the fabric of life to unravel.
So yeah, when you have an asset store and when you have software that can just procedurally generate flowers and foliage and mountains, although mountains might take a little bit more work, you just aren't spending a lot of time with your hand on the canvas, figuratively speaking. If you can just swipe a brush, figuratively speaking, on a painting canvas, and in one stroke paint the Mona Lisa, then you're not really going to spend as much focus or time making the Mona Lisa, and then it won't be as good as the Mona Lisa actually was. The point I'm making here is we've spent 20 minutes now in this level, and the gameplay mechanic that seems to be the only thing that happens is you're given a path.
Reading Donnelly by the weak afternoon sunlight. He landed on the south side of the island, followed the path to the bay and climbed the mount. He did not find the caves, and he did not chart the north side. I think this is why his understanding of the island is flawed, incomplete. He stood on the mount and only wondered momentarily how to descend, but then he didn't have my reasons.
So yeah, there's quite a lot on the ground, quite a lot of textures here, but you have a gameplay mechanic that is take the up path or take the down path. Whatever path you take will give you a story. The story seemingly doesn't matter too much. I assume Donnelly is a different person, but it might be the character we're playing as here. Otherwise, if Donnelly is a different person, then he would, in my mind, have to be in some way connected to Esther.
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. You could see them from the mainland or the fishing boats, and know to send aid or impose a cordon of protection, and wait a generation until whatever pestilence stalked the cliff paths died along with its hosts. My lines are just for this, to keep any would-be rescuers at bay. The infection is not simply of the flesh.
So he's just straight up telling you he's crazy. I don't know if that's true, that really happens. That seems like a heck of a lot of work to do. I have heard that if you're stranded on an island, having two or three vertical lines of like vines hanging off a cliff is a way of differentiating from a very far distance whether a human had created the markers or whether it was a naturally growing marker. Although vertical lines out of vines on the side of the cliff would have to really stand out in contrast from the background. If the cliff was already viney, that wouldn't stand out. So it doesn't seem like there's easy ways to cross over. So we're just, I guess, committed to the high road at this point. Which I'm fine with that. But when it's not talking, basically nothing is happening here. And while something can look fairly pretty as a game that is very close to 100% flipped assets, I wouldn't really call this an asset flip game quite yet, because it does feel like it's trying to tell a story and it isn't just doing the absolute bare minimum, but it does feel like it's doing a lot of minimum effort here. And regardless of how pretty the foliage looks, it's just being repeated over and over again is going to breed familiarity and eventually breed contempt. See, I don't know if going left here is choosing a side or not, but left looks to be the high road. Sky here.
We are not
nice.
like Lot's wife, you and I. We feel no particular need to turn back. There's nothing to be seen if we did. No tired old man parting the cliffs with his arms. No gifts or Bibles laid out on the sand for the taking. No tides turning or the shrieking gulls overhead. The bones of the hermit are no longer laid out for the taking. I have stolen them away to the guts of this island, where the passages all run to black, and where we can light each other's faces by their strange luminescence.
I assume we're trying to reach this area, but I'm not sure you can actually reach that. I'm making reference to the Bible story of Lot turning back and turning into a pillar of salt because she disobeyed God's orders as I believe they were leaving Sodom and Gomorrah as it was being destroyed. Which, yeah. I probably wouldn't have gotten that audio cue had I turned around and looked behind me more. Now, it doesn't seem to me like we're getting an achievement for every bit of conversation here, which that is certainly something that could have happened. I don't think there's any way to continue upward here, unless there was a central path to get to the top of the mountain, which maybe. heard a kind of funny sound effect there. It would be more of a game if these stones did something, or looked like something. Seems like as I'm walking up the hill, the visuals are jittering and jumping a little bit. But when I'm pushing against it, yep. So, yeah, it doesn't look particularly smooth. Yeah, a game like this probably suffers quite a bit from something like Getting Over It with B'nai Foddy, where there's a game where you're doing a very simplistic action that takes a lot of skill, and as you make progress of getting to higher points in Getting Over It with B'nai Foddy, you get more conversational dialogue elements as rewards, but there's an actual gameplay element there. Or you
Dear
could
Esther,
have...
I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life.
So, Paul maybe was the lover of Esther. Paul maybe was the killer of Esther. Should we be paying attention to the Dear Esther dialogue more than any of the other dialogue? Or does any of the dialogue really matter? The director's commentary potentially allows me to take the alternate path, but clearly the path merges here and then we hit a checkpoint, because I don't think after this you can climb back up. Again, no jump button. But yeah, I definitely feel like The Witness, giving you a bunch of puzzles and considerably less dialogue, has a better experience, more of an interactive gameplay experience. These walking simulators that are the purer a walking simulator is to just simulating the effect of walking, the less it becomes a video game, in the sense that there is no no game there. Really does feel like we just went around the island. It does feel like we may be getting flashes of light. No, that may just be a lighting glitch as I turn. But it does kind of sound like there's maybe some sound effects playing. At a certain level, a game like this either needs locks on doors, or that you would have to find keys to interact with and play with, or it would need some kind of material collection, flower picking, or some kind of enemies to fight. The Chinese Room, as a developer, also made Amnesia, a machine for pigs, although seemingly they didn't make any of the Amnesia spin-offs. So maybe they remade Amnesia Machine for Pigs. So you could go that way, or you can go this way. And then they've
This hermit,
had...
this seer, this distant historian of bones and old bread, where did he vanish to? Why, asked the farmers. Why, asked Jakobsen. Why bother with your visions at all, if you're just to throw your arms up at the cliff and let it close in behind you and seal you into the belly of the island, a museum shut to all but the most devoted?
So here you have more of this bioluminescent paint. Chemicals and plants makes me wonder if there's that same chemical. Makes me wonder if one of the story paths here isn't potentially looking for a cure or disease on an island. Can't even knock over the items. They don't have any physics on it. But yeah, the Chinese room now has weirdly been put in charge of making Bloodlines Masquerade 2 a vampire live action role playing game that they've been struggling to complete. But yeah, if we're seeing bioluminescent paint and chemicals, that does imply to me that there is possibly something to that, but then there might not be much to any of this. It may very much be just up to your own decision and your own discretion as far as how you interpret the story. It seems weirdly like you can stay in the water if you hug the edges fairly quick. Now I'm going any further than this. Seems to hit deep water though. And see, maybe if you got to the backside, you can hear what could be a heartbeat sound effect.
Come back.
But that also could be the sound of a sonogram. That really sounds more like a sonogram. So, if we were to take that from a clue, maybe this is a case where you are a baby and this is more of a figurative island than a real island. Or you are the husband of Esther, and then Esther died in childbirth from being impregnated by another lover. Maybe Donnelly, probably not Donnelly though. Maybe the other guy, Peter, I think was his name. So we could have taken, again, weird split paths that don't seem to change too much. There's a lot of similar stuff.
I dreamt I stood in the center of the sun, and the solar radiation cooked my heart from the inside. My teeth will curl and my fingernails fall off into my pockets like loose change. If I could stomach, I'd eat, but all I seem capable of is salt water. Were the livestock still here, I could turn feral and gorge. I'm as emaciated as a body on a slab, opened up for a premature source of death. I've rowed to this island in a heart without a bottom, all the bacteria of my gut rising up to sing to me.
It's fairly big words, certainly if I was supposed to be a baby. So that's probably not it, but yeah. Certainly will be very weird if all of a sudden I've already kind of guessed what the narrative is. But it really wouldn't be the first time that if I played a game and just guessed a bunch of stuff that I got fairly close to what it was. But then also I have a major problem in that once I feel like there's a twist, which I always am expecting a twist in every game, I'm often dissatisfied in the fact that there isn't a twist, or that the twist that the creators of the games go with is not as interesting as the twist in my own head, at least to me. Looks like we've got some kind of Celtic cross Bible here, and a Stonehenge of some sort. So this feels like this is a four-way split. We can go that way to be higher. See, this cross is effectively northeast southwest. We can go that way to be lower, and maybe even that's the way we would have entered had we not taken the high path, which that's certainly a thought. What you potentially would want to do is, not sure I can actually go up this direction. Is do much like how the first Assassin's Creed game worked, in that there were walls that were effectively fogged out. I guess I can't go that way. And in those fogged out walls, you only open those new areas as you move the story and the narrative forward, and restored more of your genetic memory in the first Assassin's Creed game, and that concept continues. Now this too is not really a path. Interesting. So, yeah, you could take this concept of a walking simulator and expand it to instead being a hidden object game. And then you could have gated sections where you have to find certain objects or stand in an area for a long enough time looking for objects before you can move forward. That helps solve the problem of a game like this being too short, which this game could be fairly short if it wasn't slowing me down and making me walk somewhat slow, and if it didn't have a lot of just paths and trails. I don't feel like the real world experience of walking paths or hiking walking trails is equatable to a video game per se. You just don't get that fresh air, you don't get the feeling of dirt under your feet, you don't have all of the smells and sounds of animals and nature. So yeah, it just doesn't really compare. And you definitely, in the real world, don't have like high levels of repetition. I guess this is the way we're going.
Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. But although I have all the reports and all the witnesses, and have cross-referenced them within a millimetre using my Ordnance Survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turn-off for Sanford and the welcome brake services, but although I can always see it in my rear-view mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore.
It's funny he says pull ashore, but he's talking about the M5, which is a UK-based like highway. I think it's a highway, anyways. So that would be an indication to me that Esther died on the road. That would be my guess as to what happened there. Which, if she died on the road, in like a car accident or something like that, then you don't have the dying in childbirth. Although it doesn't fully ruin the possibility that she was pregnant. She could have been pregnant and then died on the road in a car accident, or even been walking and hit by a car as a pedestrian. Well, I'm suspecting that because we hit that load, we hit a chapter. And so I suspect we are now in chapter 2 of 4. And so this makes for a decent spot to end this episode. Now, I am severely concerned. I know this game's a walking simulator, so I'm not really expecting too much from it, but I'm severely concerned that I'll run out of criticisms of this game before I run out of gameplay of this game. Particularly even with the developer commentary mode on, we may find there is not that much conversation happening and that much information being revealed. So yeah, and certainly this whole story could just not be really that impactful. This does definitely, from the visuals, look like the kind of game that could receive some praise, but it probably doesn't deserve a lot of praise just because at the time when it first released, the first version of it looked very pretty. Unfortunately, a lot of video game critics tend to heap praises on very pretty games and short games sometimes too, just because they don't have a lot of time and they're vain, I guess, is the other implication there, or assumption there. Whereas I would say gamers these days and video game critics need to be way more cautious on that, and I think we are. I think we're at a point where all games look pretty, so praising a game because it looks pretty is not realistic. Praising even an independent game that had been created by one person that looks fairly good looking is not something that you need to do or should do. It is almost always the default that you assume a game should look pretty and look as good as your average other games. Unfortunately, that may have created a situation where games are just way too expensive to create nowadays, and the demand for high quality is unattainable in a lot of cases. But heck, that's not a gamer's fault to demand high quality products. That's just a problem that developers are going to have to deal with. Anyways, that's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want to support me further, there's a link down below. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.